Imagine a fork in the road. One path leads to the story we all know. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, married to Priscilla, descending into a spiral of prescription drugs and tragic decline. The other path? It remains shrouded in mystery, a tantalizing what if that has haunted music historians and Elvis fans for decades. What if the king had chosen differently? What if, instead of marrying the teenage girl he met in Germany, Elvis had walked down the aisle with the fiery redhead who matched his energy step for step? What if Ann-Margret had become Mrs. Presley? This isn't idle speculation or romantic fantasy. This is a serious examination of a pivotal moment that could have altered the trajectory of American popular culture. Because when Elvis Presley met Ann-Margret on the set of Viva Las Vegas in 1963, something electric happened. A connection so powerful that all of those who witnessed it believed they were watching two halves of the same coin finally come together. Today, we're stepping off the beaten path of established history. We're exploring the road not taken, the alternate timeline that might have been. And what we discover along the way might surprise you, because sometimes the paths we don't choose reveal just as much about destiny as the ones we do. To understand why an Elvis-Ann-Margret union seemed so inevitable to those around them, you first need to grasp just how perfectly aligned these two stars were. This wasn't a case of opposites attracting. This was more like two satellites suddenly recognizing they'd been orbiting the same sun all along. Think about it this way. If you were designing the perfect partner for Elvis Presley in a laboratory, you might very well end up with someone remarkably similar to Ann-Margret. Both had skyrocketed to fame with meteoric speed, burning bright in Hollywood's firmament. Both thrived on the adrenaline of performance, living for those moments when the spotlight hit and the audience roared. Both had that rare quality, call it charisma, magnetism, or star power, that made cameras love them and audiences unable to look away. But the connections ran deeper than career parallels. They both craved the rush of danger, whether it came from pushing a motorcycle to its limits on an open highway or diving into the emotional depths of a song. Music wasn't just their profession. It was their first language, the way they made sense of the world. They both treasured family bonds above almost everything else, and both carried a spiritual dimension that grounded them even as fame threatened to untether them from reality. Ann-Margret herself captured this uncanny synchronicity in her reflections, describing them as kindred spirits who presented one face to the world while harboring wild, untamed souls within. They both lived right at the edge, she observed, dancing with self-destruction in their own distinct ways. Despite achieving everything the entertainment industry could offer, both remained emotionally vulnerable, almost childlike in their need for unconditional acceptance, the kind of pure love their parents had given them. The men in Elvis's inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia, saw this compatibility immediately. According to those closest to Elvis, including his cousin Billy Smith, the decision between Ann-Margret and Priscilla tortured him. It wasn't a clear choice. Smith believed that if circumstances had forced Elvis's hand, Ann would have been the one walking down that aisle. Marty Lacker, another member of the inner circle, put it even more bluntly. Given a true ultimatum, Elvis would have chosen Ann. The irony? Elvis's attraction to Priscilla had initially stemmed from her malleability. She was 14 when they met, essentially a blank canvas he could shape according to his vision of the ideal woman. With Ann-Margret, that was never an option. She arrived fully formed, a confident, successful actress with her own career trajectory and identity. By the time Bye Bye Birdie made her a household name, Ann-Margret had already established herself as a force to be reckoned with. Elvis couldn't mold her into his fantasy. He had to accept her as she was. And here's the remarkable part. In the beginning, he was willing to do exactly that. To fully appreciate the Ann-Margret alternative, we need to examine the reality of what actually happened: Elvis's relationship with Priscilla Beaulieu. This isn't about assigning blame or casting judgments. It's about understanding the dynamics that shaped one of entertainment history's most famous marriages and ultimately contributed to its dissolution. When Elvis encountered Priscilla in Germany, she was a child. There's no getting around that fact. He was 24, she was 14. The age gap alone set up a troubling power imbalance, but the situation grew more complex when Priscilla moved into Graceland in 1963. At that point, Elvis didn't just become her boyfriend, he essentially became her architect. Imagine being a teenager and having someone control not just your schedule, but your appearance, your social interactions, even your educational choices. Elvis orchestrated every detail of Priscilla's life, from how she styled her hair to who she could befriend. It was a level of control that, in retrospect, seems suffocating, though at the time, both participants viewed it through the lens of protection and devotion. Priscilla herself later revealed the extent of this control. Elvis insisted that women had their place, and whenever she voiced opinions that contradicted his, he'd remind her of the gender hierarchy as he saw it. He discouraged her from pursuing education beyond high school, reasoning that if he didn't need it, she didn't either. The unspoken requirement was that Priscilla needed to be perpetually available, ready to appear at Elvis's side the instant he called. George Klein, one of Elvis's closest friends, shared a telling anecdote that illuminates Elvis's mindset. During the filming of Girl Happy in 1964, Steve McQueen expressed interest in meeting Elvis. Normally gracious with fellow celebrities, Elvis uncharacteristically refused. The reason? McQueen had just filmed steamy scenes with Ann-Margret in The Cincinnati Kid. Elvis couldn't stomach the thought of his romantic interest, even as just a girlfriend, sharing intimate moments with another man on screen, even fictional ones. Klein and the others realized that if Elvis reacted this intensely to Ann-Margret's movie romances while they were dating, imagine the torment if she'd been his wife. Now here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Priscilla eventually broke free. She transformed herself from Elvis's carefully constructed creation into her own person. But that liberation came with a price. Once divorced, she was no longer positioned to intervene in Elvis's downward spiral. She watched helplessly as the man she'd once been married to destroyed himself with prescription medications and increasingly erratic behavior. Which brings us back to our central question. Would Ann-Margret have been different? Could she have saved him? At first glance, Ann-Margret seemed to offer everything Priscilla couldn't. She was Elvis's contemporary, his equal in the entertainment world, his match in every way that mattered. Unlike Priscilla, she brought her own established identity to the relationship. She wasn't someone Elvis could shape. She was someone he had to meet halfway. Ann-Margret recognized this compatibility too. In her recollections, she emphasized how seamlessly their lives intertwined. They shared passions for motorcycles, music, and the electric thrill of performance. Their families mattered deeply to both of them. They held similar spiritual beliefs. And crucially, Ann-Margret insisted that their parallel careers posed no conflict because they respected each other's professional lives equally. But here's where we need to pause and look more carefully, because this is where the fantasy starts to crack. Consider what Ann-Margret's statement actually reveals. She believed their careers weren't a problem because of mutual respect. That's a mature, healthy perspective from her side. But respect isn't the same as acceptance, and Ann-Margret seems to have underestimated just how deeply Elvis's possessiveness ran. Lamar Fike, another Memphis Mafia member, saw through this optimistic assessment. He believed Elvis would have married Ann-Margret in a heartbeat, but only under one condition: she'd have to abandon her career entirely. This wasn't a negotiable point for Elvis. It was rooted in his traditional Southern upbringing, his belief that a wife's place was in the home, preparing dinner for her husband's return. Ann-Margret's dedication to her craft, her lifelong pursuit of success, made such a sacrifice unthinkable. However, one thing is abundantly clear: she wouldn't have wanted to abandon her career, which she worked extremely hard for years to achieve. She grew up extremely poor in the small town of Valsjöbyn, Sweden, for the first 6 years of her life. They had no running water and lived miles from any large town. When she and her mother moved to Illinois to join her father, and at the time she spoke no English. It was a tough way to start her life in the U.S. The Steve McQueen incident we mentioned earlier becomes even more significant in this light. If Elvis couldn't handle watching Ann-Margret perform romantic scenes with other actors while they were dating, how would he cope with a lifetime of such scenes? The jealousy, the possessiveness, the need for control, these weren't bugs in Elvis's programming. They were fundamental features. And then there's the other woman problem, or rather, the other women problem, plural. Let's address the elephant in the room: Elvis Presley's chronic infidelity. This wasn't an occasional lapse or a brief moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a lifestyle, an almost compulsive behavior that persisted regardless of his relationship status. According to Marty Lacker, Elvis never stopped pursuing other women. Not when he was seriously dating someone, not when he was engaged, not even when he was married. Lacker believed Elvis felt obligated to maintain this behavior, as if his image as a sex symbol demanded it. Of course, we have to be completely real. Not only was he a rock star, he was the first rock star to ever achieve that kind of fame. Imagine what that was like, literally like a kid in a candy store. He was a worldwide star with his considerable looks, that magnificent voice, magnetism, and charisma. It's been proven time and time again that many rock stars are unable to say no to that kind of temptation. He was constantly surrounded by adoring, pretty women who pursued him relentlessly. Think about what this meant for any potential marriage. Both Elvis and Ann-Margret were entertainment professionals, which meant extended periods apart. She'd be on movie sets. He'd be in recording studios or Las Vegas or on tour. The separation that comes with show business careers is challenging enough for faithful partners. For someone with Elvis's track record, it was an invitation to infidelity. Ann-Margret might have tolerated Elvis's wandering eye while they were dating. Many women in the entertainment industry develop a pragmatic acceptance of their partner's indiscretions, understanding them as part of the territory. But tolerance as a girlfriend is vastly different from tolerance as a wife. The commitment of marriage brings with it expectations of exclusivity that even the most understanding partner is unlikely to compromise on indefinitely. Here's where we need to be honest about the math. If an Elvis-Ann-Margret marriage was likely to crumble, and the evidence strongly suggests it would have, then she couldn't have saved him, because you can't save someone when you're not there. Just like Priscilla, Ann-Margret would have eventually found herself on the outside, watching the man she loved self-destruct, powerless to intervene. The tragedy isn't that Elvis chose wrong. The tragedy is that he was probably incapable of making a choice that would have worked. Even after both married other people, Elvis to Priscilla in May 1967, Ann-Margret to Roger Smith in the same year, the connection between Elvis and Ann-Margret refused to fade. It persisted like a phantom limb, a reminder of what might have been. Ann-Margret recounts 2 particularly poignant moments that reveal the enduring nature of their bond. The first occurred just 2 months after both weddings, when Elvis attended one of her Las Vegas performances. Backstage, away from prying eyes, Elvis did something that sounds almost cinematic in its drama. He dropped to one knee, took her hands, and confessed in hushed, serious tones that his feelings remained unchanged. She knew it already, Ann-Margret admitted, but hearing him say it struck her deeply. 5 years later, in December 1972, another backstage encounter. Another late-night phone call to her hotel room. Elvis, admitting to loneliness, asking if he could see her privately. Ann-Margret had been anticipating the question all day, dreading it even while knowing it might come. Her response was gentle but firm. "You know I can't." Elvis's reply acknowledged the impossibility while making his position clear. "I know, but I just want you to know that I still feel the same." These weren't the words of someone who'd moved on. These were the words of someone trapped in amber, frozen in a moment of romantic possibility that had long since passed. Elvis Presley, arguably the most famous entertainer on the planet, a man who could have virtually any woman he wanted, was still emotionally tethered to the one who got away. But let's not romanticize this too much. Unfulfilled longing is often sweeter than fulfilled promises. It's easy to idealize a relationship that never had to weather the storms of daily life, that never faced the mundane conflicts and compromises that real marriages require. Elvis and Ann-Margret's love remained perfect precisely because it remained potential. The moment it became actual, it would have been subject to all the same pressures that destroyed Elvis's marriage to Priscilla, and probably would have met the same fate. We've examined the compatibility, the obstacles, the passion, and the practical realities. Now it's time to confront the hardest truth of all. Elvis Presley himself was the unchangeable variable in this equation. It doesn't matter if Ann-Margret was his perfect match. It doesn't matter if she understood him better than anyone else. It doesn't matter if their connection was genuine and deep and powerful. Because none of those factors address the fundamental issue. Elvis's self-destructive trajectory was set in motion by forces that no romantic partner, however ideal, could have redirected. Consider the bigger picture. Elvis's decline wasn't primarily about loneliness or an unhappy marriage. It was about the crushing weight of fame, the isolation that comes with iconic status, the pharmaceutical dependence that started as a solution to insomnia and pain, but metastasized into something far more sinister. It was about the disconnect between who Elvis actually was and who the world needed him to be. It was about the impossible expectations placed on someone who'd been extraordinary for so long that ordinary human struggles seemed like betrayals to his audience. And so we return to where we started, that fork in the road, those two possible paths. And now, having walked down the road not taken in our imaginations, having examined it from every angle, we can finally answer the questions we posed at the beginning. Would a marriage between Elvis and Ann-Margret have lasted? Almost certainly not. The obstacles were simply too formidable. Elvis's need for control would have clashed with Ann-Margret's independence. His jealousy would have tormented him every time she filmed a romantic scene. Her career ambitions would have seemed like rejection to someone who needed to be the center of his partner's universe. And his infidelity would have eventually eroded whatever foundation they'd built together. Even if they'd made it past the wedding, they likely wouldn't have made it to the end. Could Ann-Margret have saved Elvis? Again, probably not. Because by the time she would have exited his life, either through divorce or separation, Elvis would have been just as alone, just as vulnerable to the forces that ultimately destroyed him. She would have become another person standing helplessly on the sidelines, watching someone she loved disappear into prescription bottles and increasingly erratic behavior. But here's what we gain from exploring this alternative timeline: perspective. Understanding that Elvis's fate likely wasn't contingent on choosing the right romantic partner helps us see his story with more clarity. It wasn't a tale of a wrong choice or a missed opportunity. It was a tale of a man caught in forces larger than any individual relationship could address. Ann-Margret herself seems to have understood this. She didn't spend the rest of her life pining for what might have been. She built a successful career, a lasting marriage, and a full life. But she also kept a place in her heart for Elvis, honoring what they shared without allowing it to define her. That's perhaps the healthiest possible response to a great what if. Acknowledge it, treasure it, but don't let it prevent you from living your actual life. There's a strange phenomenon that occurs with alternative histories. Sometimes the stories that never happened tell us more about human nature than the ones that did. By imagining what could have been, we gain insight into what actually was. The Elvis Ann-Margret What If reveals several uncomfortable truths about fame, relationships, and personal demons. It shows us that talent, success, and even genuine love don't necessarily translate into happiness or longevity. It demonstrates that some people carry within them a kind of internal time bomb that no external circumstances can fully diffuse. It reminds us that our culture's habit of building up icons and then consuming them has real human costs. Those who were close to both Elvis and Ann-Margret seem to agree on one point. The connection between them was real and profound. This wasn't manufactured romance for publicity purposes. This wasn't wishful thinking from fans who wanted their favorite stars to unite. This was two people who genuinely understood each other, who saw themselves reflected in each other's eyes, who felt that rare sense of finding someone who spoke their language. That's the bittersweet lesson here. Sometimes being perfectly matched isn't enough. Sometimes understanding someone completely doesn't mean you can live with them successfully. Sometimes loving someone deeply doesn't translate into being able to save them. This doesn't diminish what they shared. The electricity between Elvis and Ann-Margret on the set of Viva Las Vegas was real. The continued feelings that persisted long after they both married others were genuine. The potential for something extraordinary existed. But potential isn't the same as inevitable, and chemistry isn't the same as compatibility in the long term. What we do know is this: two extraordinary people found each other, recognized something profound in each other, and then had to let each other go. That's not a unique story. It plays out in countless lives across the world, famous and anonymous alike. But when it involves the king of rock and roll and one of Hollywood's brightest stars, it becomes the stuff of legend. And legends, whether they unfold or remain forever potential, have a way of teaching us about the complexity of being human. The road not taken will forever remain shrouded in mystery. But maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe some questions are more valuable unanswered, some paths more meaningful unexplored.
If you like the video, please like and subscribe. We hope to see you again soon.